This podcast is brought to you by Ziva, Functional Training Institute's exclusive equipment partner. Engineered for purpose and performance, Ziva's elite equipment supports every rep, every move, and every goal. Hey, it's Coach Tarek, the host of the Purpose Driven Movement podcast. In this fascinating session, Recovery and Fluid Flow, the secrets to performance and longevity, I chat with my good friend and mentor, Ian O'Dwyer. Ian is a giant of the fitness industry, going way back to 1999 as one of the founders of PT on the Net. People like Paul Chek, Ian O'Dwyer himself, really one of the forefathers, if you will, of functional training as we know it today. And this session is fascinating. We discuss things like eustress versus de-stress and really treating recovery as a integrated process, not simply you do something at the end of a session or an activity, and really understanding the difference between performance and longevity. We deep dive into this from a philosophical perspective and a real applicable perspective too. If you're an end user, you're a client, or you're a exercise, fitness, health, wellness professional, this episode is for you. Check out the Functional Training Institute's latest offer, which is 15% off of any of our online training courses. Simply go to functionaltraininginstitute.com and input PDM15 at cart checkout. Pleasure having you on the show once again, Ian. How are you doing?
Great to see you, Tarek. Great to be back. I'm doing well. There's some exciting things happening as we have had a previous few words on, so it'll be some nice things to share with the viewer.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit jumpy. I need to sort of settle myself because there's so many good things to talk about. And every time we chat, there's just this fascination around health, wellness, movement, and it just becomes beautiful to have these philosophical discussions.
What's nice about our opportunities is that because we have such a parallel background in how we would like to see the industry evolve, and it's from an authentic background. It's not from stuff that we've just taken from someone else and then modified to suit. It's what we've actually experienced and what we believe is actually the best way going forward. So that's why it gets exciting. We start yakking and all of a sudden, the ideas start going off left, right and center. So I'm excited for today, my friend.
Yeah, me too. And you've been at this for so long now, since when, 2001 or 2?
1999.
1999. That was when I was still a teenager at the time, and you were one of my inspirations, of course. And I consider you as one of the fathers of functional and this movement type focus on exercise as opposed to the rigidity and the traditional elements that are still necessary. So those listeners, I'm not sure how much you shared in your previous episode, but for me anyway, I was definitely inspired by you and the folks at the PT on the Net. And then it's incredible, though, that journey from 1999 to now. I'm just interested from your perspective, how has that shifted? What have been the biggest epochs for you since 1999 to sort of present day?
Tarek, I feel we've actually gone backwards in some aspects, which saddens me a little bit. And what I mean by that is when I came into the industry in 1999 as a full-time business owner, everything we did in the industry was very evidence-based practice. In other words, if we didn't have the science and we didn't have the research, we couldn't apply it, it got boo-hooed. And then, in the transition of consulting for PT on the Net, and then 6 of us put together PTA Global, which was an advanced education organization in the States. What we took was, or what we brought to the industry was functional anatomy. We bought system science and tools. We bought energy system developments. We bought play. We bought, fascial mobilizations. We bought all this new stuff, all this stuff that wasn't, behavioral change, that wasn't in the ethos of the industry. And I guess what that really did in 2008, 9, 10 is it changed it from evidence-based practice to practice-based evidence. And what I meant by that is that the people coming into your practices had to get an outcome, had to get a response, had to get an experience that enabled them to want to come back. And me, as you've experienced being a semi-professional footballer, we've had many times where we've had injuries and had to have gone to, allied health professionals and their intentions to help us, but unfortunately their execution didn't. So we had to then step back and look at how the industry needed to change. And we had to be more inclusive when we looked at the whole body rather than segments of it. We had to address the human being, not the human body. So we would want to connect with the behavior of the person in front of us. What did they like? What didn't they like? Were they a traditional type trainer? were they a more progressive or functional type training person? So all of these things, and then of course, PTA Global got sold, it got disbanded. And now all I'm really hearing and I'm seeing is now we've gone back to the evidence-based practice that didn't work 25 years ago, which worries me a little bit because Tarek, you and I both know that's our passion, is to create the ultimate experience for people who come to a gym, a studio, whether they're doing yoga, Pilates. I don't care what people do as long as they're doing something, but we want the experience to be the ultimate, to be the most positive outcome. So firstly, it makes me proud. Secondly, it makes me hungrier because now people like you are striving for the same things that we were striving for 25 years ago. And hopefully now with, as you say, the old buggers like us in the background, that you guys can push forward quicker because now you've got the stuff that the things that we've had to endure, the experience that we've got. We can support you now by evidence. We can support you by practical applications. We can support you by case studies where before we didn't have them. So from 1999 to 2025, what I feel is the most exciting part of our industry, whatever that industry is, whether it's fitness, whether it's wellness, whether it's health, recovery, whatever, I believe now we've got a new frontier of people coming through who have authenticity, who have values, who have the experience, and who value relationships where I don't believe we had that back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, wow. That's very insightful. We always want to bring that experience into the evidence, but the practical outcomes are really going to provide that, aren't they, for, the coach and the end user, right? So I've always loved the stuff and continue to have that at the forefront of how I educate. So thanks for sharing that, Ian. Beautiful. Now, one of those shifts and one of those things that we want to make sense of, which is the topic of this talk, is the recovery and fluid flow that you're going to discuss in a bit more detail, and specifically to understand and maybe untangle, if you like, some of those tentacles that have confused maybe the coach and the end user. And he's probably confusing as we speak. So it'd be good to sort of dive into this area now, this area that has become the fascination of a lot of coaches, a lot of facilities now are wanting to put in, cold plunge, hot plunge, cryotherapy, you name it, right? Anything from those large items to smaller components of what constitutes recovery. So here we are, we're going to dive into this, the origins and your approach and your company's approach now, SOMA, to this field, if you like.
Let's understand from the very get-go one thing, that what we're talking about is stress. That's all we're talking about. It's stress. How do I take stress out of the body that doesn't need to be there? We need stress, nothing to be scared of, but we need eustress, not distress. Eustress is stress that improves mental acuity, improves the ability for the nervous system to heal the body, to help the body perform, to make better decisions, to have oxygen flow and so forth. Distress is what now shuts the body down, which is what creates, fight, flight, freeze, or faint. Distress is something that will detract from the tissues of the body and will actually affect performance. So realistically, we're talking about stress, and we're talking about, Tarek, the environmental stressors. So you where you live, I where I live, beautiful sunshiny day here. We've had lots and lots of rain. People have been getting stressed because everything's been so wet, and all of a sudden you have mold starting to grow in a tropical area, which is normal, but mold growing in houses. Kids are struggling to get to school without getting damp and wet. Colds, all those sorts of things start to happen. So this stress is because simply of the weather. Now that stress has an effect on the person. And the interesting thing is, if we talk about an environmental stress, if someone gets distressed, the first thing that happens is they stop breathing. Now, if they stop breathing, the autonomic nervous system kicks in and you go into freeze, fight, freeze, faint, or whatever it may be. So you're in a scenario now where you don't breathe because of the stress. We have 20 liters of fluid that has to flow through the body. So if we go back one step further and we look at the components of the body: nerve, 70% water; muscle, 70% water; bones, 30% water; skin, 70% water; fascia, 70% water. So in those 5 components, there's a fair bit of water. But we haven't spoken about the other 2, which is blood, 92% water, and lymph, 96% water. So without these 2, these 5 don't function. So if we've got 7 tissues that require a bucket load of water to move, because if it doesn't move, what will happen is the fluid will now stagnate. So in other words, if I think about it, just put a vision in your head, Tarek, that I've got a river that runs from my feet up to my collarbones. And that river is 13 to 14 litres of lymph, 5 to 6 litres of blood. So 20 liters of fluid that starts in my feet that has to come all the way up. So you think about it, comes through the ankles, bony structure, up through the calves, meaty structure, through the knees, bony structure, through the thighs, meaty structure, through the pelvis, bony structure, through the gut, meaty structure, through the chest, very bony structure. And if you think about that river that runs up either leg and runs up into the collarbone, if every bony structure is a narrow part of the river, if a tree falls into a narrow part of the river, what's it going to do to the fluid flow? It's going to restrict it, right? And it's kind of funny because when we start looking at lymph nodes, there's a lymph node that's about 50 mil above the malleoli, the inside of the ankle bone, about 2 inches, 50 mil above it, a little bit higher. There's a lymph node about a hand's width above the crease of the back of the knee. There's lymph nodes in the crease of your groin. There's 70% of your lymph is in your gut. There's a lymph pump that sits at the base of your rib cage, and your lymph ducts live in the collarbone area of your trunk. So it's interesting, mate, because everywhere there's lymph nodes, the joints below tend to swell when they don't flow. And that inflammation causes pain, discomfort, and potentially disease. So when we talk about recovery, what we're really talking about is, can we get the tissues of the body to extrinsically and intrinsically recover to a state of original health and wellness and performance? And can we do that by decreasing the amount of stress? When I mean stress, if I get to a recovery center, and I'll use me as an example, who spent 20 years in cold water and ice for 30, 35 minutes a time. You put me in an ice bath, I will, mate, there'll be some stuff coming out of my mouth, or I can tear it out. You won't want to cup it, because emotionally, I am going to be stressed because I know how much it used to hurt for that time frame. Now, we know the research says, now 2 to 3 minutes tops is the ideal time, but we had loads of time in there. So your body was numb and you got out and moved like a robot. No wonder the fluid wasn't moving, right? So we've got to understand that if we're going to give some sort of recovery to reset the tissues, the stress levels in the body, firstly, we need to understand, what does the person actually enjoy? Do they want heat or do they want cold? Do they want wet or do they want dry recovery? Because you can do dry recovery. We could use whole body vibration. We could use percussion. We could use breathing. We could use mobility. There's so many things we could use without even getting wet that is really effective.
Attention fitness professionals worldwide. Idea World, the premier global fitness convention, is coming to California, USA this July 17th to 19th. This is your opportunity to earn up to 20 CEC hours from internationally recognized educators while connecting with the industry's most passionate professionals. The Idea World Fitness and Nutrition Expo runs alongside the convention and is completely free and open to the public, featuring cutting-edge gear, technology and nutrition products from leading global brands. Don't miss this career-defining event. Register now at ideafit.com/world and use code PDM25 for a special discount on full registration. Yeah, sorry to halt you there. I was just going to say, how do you determine those preferences for that individual?
Really simply, mate. Feel SOMA has developed a lifestyle questionnaire. It's 5 questions based around nutrition, hydration, movement, sleep, and mood. And if you ask the 3 questions per of those headings, it will give you basically a score out of 1 to 3, 1 being poor, 3 being great. And if you get a 1 in any of those scores, you need to address it. Are you dehydrated? Have you eaten? Have you slept less than 5 hours? Just simple things, right? That will dictate where you need to go first with your application. Do I need to address some things before I start? Because if I don't, if I'm dehydrated and I'm going to give someone a high intensity session, I'm probably going to be in a chance that I may injure the person, or they won't perform well, or they won't be able to recover from the session well. That's the first thing we do. The second thing I would do is, as I've always done for 30 years of coaching, I ask my clients, now, this is how the start of your session could look. We could use a foam roller, we could use a percussion gun, we could do some breathing, we could play a game. Which one would you like to do for the next 3 minutes? Imagine that. Imagine asking rather than telling, Tarek.
Yeah, that drives up the engagement. That's wonderful. Yeah.
And it's funny, mate, because you and I don't stop laughing when we see each other. Why? Because we enjoy each other's company, but it's a game. We have this ability to have a vision, but to also have application and to be able then to story tell and describe where we want to take this or where it's come from or where it's been or how we improved it.
And it's interesting because you said at the very beginning, it is about that relationship. So it's that connection that you have, treating the client as the human, as that person. And when you start that process, you fall into a flow state with them and you're able to be creative in that moment where it's like you pre-plan stuff, of course, so you actually know what they need, perhaps know what they want to balance those together. And then you go and offer them 3 or 4 things that are going to be beneficial for that session. Let's say you've pre-framed it as you said earlier. So I think I wanted to preface that for the listeners because it's not a matter of, okay, here's a choice of 4 things. It's actually built on the foundation of actually understanding who that client is. Obviously, by doing the testing and all of that stuff, but actually treating them as a human and knowing the emotional, intelligent component of it, I think is important.
It's a very good point to make, mate. And you're not just throwing stuff in there because it's stuff. You have an understanding of, what people require to allow tissues to, basically advance or evolve as the session goes on, as the relationship goes on. So it's really important. And that's why it's important to understand not just the tools that you use on a client, but to understand what you're trying to do with the client or for the client. So, for instance, just to give you an example, to give the listeners an understanding, breath's something that everyone's talking about. So why do we breathe? Well, it's good for us. It settles our nervous system. All right. How? Because I want to know how this works, right? So it's interesting because you see lots of people breathe, but they don't actually breathe through the nose, into the diaphragm, out through the mouth on the nose. They actually breathe into their chest. So they're not really breathing. They're just surviving. They're not thriving. They're surviving. So why do we breathe? Why do we breathe nasally? Just so we understand why. Well, if I wanted to stimulate someone and I wanted to raise their awareness, I would put my hand on my left side of my nose and get them to breathe in through their right side. If I want to take someone and now put them into a parasympathetic response, I might close my right side and get them to breathe through my left side of my nose. So the reason we breathe through our nose is we take oxygen that's acidic from the environment. So we would call that a stressor. We breathe through our nose. The filtration system in our nose filters the oxygen, and then it floods over the sinuses, which is filled with nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide is really cool stuff. It's stuff that we produce. We get it through eating leafy greens. We get it through 30 minutes of sunshine. We get it through 30 minutes of exercise a day. 3 things. As we get older, we produce less of it. So it's really important we eat leafy greens, get sunshine, and move. So what's interesting about that is that when the nitric oxide is absorbed into our system, what that nitric oxide does is in every blood vessel, it allows the walls of the blood vessels to relax. And what the walls relaxing does is allows more blood flow, more oxygen, more nutrients, grabs the waste in the blood system. It also lowers blood pressure and it resets the autonomic nervous system just through breathing through your nose. That's why breath is so important. But it's okay to breathe laying down. More important if I can breathe standing up, because that's where we live, right, mate? So it's interesting, Tarek, because we use terms that people don't necessarily understand. What does that really mean? I love what you just said then. You prefaced it by saying we know what we're trying to address. So what's really cool about nasal breathing is that it creates vasodilation, which is that whole process of the nitric oxide. But so does working on the bone with a percussion gun or using a roller or using a ball. Stimulating the bone stimulates the most abundant mechanoreceptor. So the mechanical moving receptor that feeds back to the brain that's in fascia is called the interstitial receptor. And that interstitial receptor is most abundant inside bones and around bones. So if I stimulate bones, it stimulates vasodilation. So it's kind of cool. I could use a roller and breathing to restore someone in minutes so that they're ready, they're bouncing, they're ready to go for their session.
And then you're offering them that dual tasking to a degree as well. So you might have not just one thing, a dual task, so it becomes cognitive as well. And then it becomes an ingrained thing that it's not just like a rote thing, but it's a necessary thing. So in the end, it becomes this regulated good thing that they're doing, i.e. breathing through the nose more often than they're not, unless it's really strenuous exercise. A point you made earlier is, you talked about the external environment and the different stressors, whether it's sound or something more traumatic. So we're always fighting toxins and whatnot and noise pollution. But you made a good point around the exercise. So if we don't have our clients, for example, regulating their breathing, how many more elements of stressors are you adding in because they're not breathing properly? And as you said, whether they come in stressed and you're not reading that, for example, or whether they've had some sort of traumatic psychological moment, they're not able to reveal it. It's poker faced, if you like. It's really important, isn't it, to be able to kind of manage that through mitigating it by getting them to breathe better in the first place, getting them to feel comfortable with rolling on their tissue using, foam rollers and other implements. Can you talk about that and how you would frame that for, well, whether they're consumers or trainers who are prescribing exercise or movement?
Tarek, I'm going to share a story with you with my very last client that I had before this podcast. So I get a phone call. This guy's been referred from a guy that looked after many, many years ago. He has a surf club down the road. This guy's had a tibial plateau spiral fracture, so a major breaking of the tibia, right up near the patella, up near the kneecap. And he's an ex-footballer, had an injury through his whole football career, goes and plays in a Masters tournament, bang, smashes this tibia, right? And then not only does that, PCL, posterior cruciate ligament, has another fracture a bit lower down the tibia. Like, it's just made a mess of it, right? He's 42 years of age, and all he wants to do is surf, right? Surfing is his passion. Now, he comes into me, doesn't know me from, diddly squat. He's been referred and told that I do things differently. And the fear, the anxiety in this guy, because he didn't think he would be able to surf again, was just through the roof. It was just, I mean, you know me, I know you. We've had our injuries, mate. We've built our bodies over the years. We know what it takes to get through an injury and how to come out the other side. This guy's never had an injury and he's played a sport like rugby. Anyway, so I got a stick out. I got him to do a sit and reach, which is just a sitting pattern with a stick. Of course, what did he do? He's an ex-footballer. He did a squat. And I explained that a squat is an egotistical movement that we tell the body, I want to do a sit to where it feels that tension before we actually go into pain. And that's asking the body. That's the humility side. So I said, the biggest thing I didn't say to you is that I'm going to get you to breathe. Now, you can imagine he's coming in, he's fearful, he's not breathing, right? He can squat like the surgeon's done an amazing job on the knee, and his squat was amazing, but there was pain in his knee. So I got him to do a 4-second breath in. As he descended, he pushed the stick forward. As he then ascended, he exhaled, stood back up, and it gave him the opportunity to feel what his tissues were telling him, because the tissues are always whispering to us. If we choose to listen, that's humility. If we ignore it, that's ego. So we then did a couple of little things where I just changed the direction. So we started to multi-directionally get him to move, that then initially put more discomfort into his knee. And he said, wow, that knee didn't like that. And I said, yeah, I can see that. So why do you think that is? So I don't know. So I stuck him near a wall about a hand's width away from the wall. And I said, do the sit and reach and see if you can just slide your butt to the wall. Because you could see his butt wasn't, his hips weren't working right, weren't functioning like they should be. He couldn't do it. And he's gone, you're kidding me. It's my hips, isn't it? I said, yeah. I said, do you have back pain? He said, I've got 2 bulging discs. Didn't tell me that. So we just did some really simple maneuvers, movements to the wall. Then I got a ball and just put it onto his hip into the wall whilst he was standing. Came back, did the sit and reach. He just went down, no pain. And he said, I can surf, can't I? I said, yeah. Now, mate, that's the beauty of it. As you've seen many times, as you've coached, it's connecting with him, because I know, as you know, I know how much it hurts to know that you can't do what you want to do. I'm not a surfer. My son is. I wish I could surf, but I don't. He loves it. This guy loved it. I could feel his passion. If I could give him back 5% of hope, I knew that we were going to be on a winner. Anyway, as he said, like, I can't believe it.
That's amazing. It's very explorative, what you're sharing there. And it's a bi-directional thing with the coach and client. And the story that you provided there is you offered him the questions first and allowed him to explore. And this I love the idea of humility versus ego, because, even as I continue to do my own movement practice, I know, okay, I'm feeling a bit off here. I know exactly what's wrong. So I need to recover. So I need to foam roll, or I need to do some stretch holds or some breath work. And I don't think it's necessarily just an age thing. I don't want to fall into that kind of philosophical trap. I think just knowing to say, well, hang on, that gear 4 to 5 intensity, which obviously comes from your language. Today, maybe it's not gear 4 or 5, maybe it's just gear 1 or gear 2, meaning less intense, recovering the tissue, breath work. So yeah, I wanted to just drum home that point. I think it's very powerful. And I love that contrasting between humility and ego as in the movement spectrum. We think of it as concepts that are, kind of psychological, but they're more than that.
I think it's important for the listener to know that we've been egotistical in what we've done. We're not pointing the fingers at anyone because that's how we've learned. We've had to actually sit and say, hang on, this isn't working. I'm not enjoying this. Just as you said, there's days that you've gone in there and you've got a fair idea, you know what you need to do, but you push through it. And then the next day, your back's a bit cranky, your knees a bit cranky, your shoulders a bit cranky, purely because probably what I needed to do was an intensity drop of maybe, as you say, 60 to 70 max heart rate tops, just so that you could reset your tissues, reset your fuses, and that way that the next time you go to the gym, you go to the session, you go to whatever you want to do, you're ready to go. So, yeah, we've been the people who have made the mistakes of pushing the ego. Don't worry about that.
That's great. Thanks for layering that in. It's this whole concept of recovery where it seems that we're necessarily going back and forth because it means that what is the definition of recovery then? And I want to focus in on this concept of performance versus health. And also thinking pre-session versus post-session. If you can just elaborate on those things, yeah.
Beautifully put. I love that because, recovery isn't just doing something at the end of a session. It doesn't work that way. Those first 5 questions we have in our lifestyle questionnaire are based around everything away from the gym or the experience. What's your nutrition? What's your hydration? If you've got someone who's going to use a whole body vibration plate first thing in the morning and they haven't eaten, good luck, because I can tell you right now, those things chew a lot of energy. And I've had clients that have actually told me they've eaten and they've almost passed out on the plate and they've then admitted they haven't eaten. So this isn't about telling them. This is about making them aware. This is about them taking responsibility. So nutrition is important for people who are fasting, for instance, because if I'm going to exercise with any intensity, I need fuel. Hydration, same thing, 20 litres of fluid, as we said. So I need hydration to now enable the tissues to move. If I've moved outside my session, do I feel any sort of restriction? Do I feel any pain or discomfort? Important to address that if I have. Have I slept and do I feel refreshed? Because if I don't, that's a big stressor. You and I both know, mate, that's probably one of the biggest stresses now on tissues if people aren't sleeping. And it's interesting, we had a piece of kit years ago that you used to wear and it would do, G-forces, it would do steps, it would do everything. Anyway, the biggest thing it did is that if you wore it to bed, it would tell you how much you tossed and turned. And one of the guys at the time that I was working with, he wore it to bed and I said next day, how'd you sleep? He said, I got 7.5 or 8 hours sleep. I said, oh, fantastic. I said, how you feel? He said, no, I don't really feel brilliant, but he said, I know I slept, for the time. We went back and had a look at how many times he tossed and turned. 84 times he tossed and turned in that night, which means you're not getting into REM, right? You're not getting into that beautiful deep sleep. So therefore, what we think is a deep sleep may not necessarily be a deep sleep or may not have you rested. So if you don't feel rested, listen to the body. And of course, mood. Do you feel like participating? Do you feel positive? Do you want to get up and go today? Or are you feeling a bit blah? Are you feeling a bit sort of, I'm not really into it? Because if I'm not, that's okay. We'll just adjust the session so that you're going to feel better when you walk out of this session. So those 5 questions are really, really simple as a way of making clients aware. So the definition of recovery for me is this is something that happens 24 hours a day in and out of the gym. So for me, the definition of recovery is being able to prepare tissue in a healthy manner to accept force in a multi-directional process. It's about being able to make good decisions under distress and physical challenge, which we would call performance. And then it's about restoring tissue health at the completion of the challenge or sport or corporate day or looking after the kids, whatever it may be. So from a Feel SOMA perspective, we would say recovery comes under an umbrella, and in that umbrella is priming and restoration. Have you primed your tissue in preparation for the challenges that you're going to come into? So that might look like mobility, that might look like stability, that might look like some percussion, some whole body vibrations, some breath, and then you perform, and then have you restored? Restoration might look like some hot and cold immersions. It might look like some compression. It might look like some percussion. Once again, whole body vibrations, some infrared lights, some breath work. So you've got, foam rolling, and you can do either end as well. You can do foam rolling in priming or foam rolling in restoration. So we've got lots of tools but we just need to know, what does the client want to do? And what have you got in your environment?
Yeah, I love that sort of, let's call it holistic or integrated, maybe is the better word of understanding recovery. And prior to us coming on, you talked about the app as enabling the coach and the user, the end user being the client, for example, to sort of know whether in the priming phase or in the restoration phase, where they're reduced, whether it's 1 to 3, 1 being that they need it most, 3 means that they're optimized. Can you talk a little bit about the functioning of that and how important that is?
Yeah, so what I've done for years and years and years is I've had an A4 sheet that's been laminated, and we've just had questions that the client fills out. We don't even ask the question anymore because it's not a test. It's just an awareness tool. So we've now developed an app that you go into, and what happens is the client just clicks on the app, questions come up about nutrition, hydration, blah, 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 and then it will give them a score of what needs to, or it'll give them an understanding of what they need to address. If there's any ones in their scoring, if they've got 2 ones, okay, address the 2 ones before you proceed. And what we've done, Tarek, is we've actually got 230 videos linked to these programs telling people what to do in the program, what they can do in their priming phase, what they can do in their restoration phase. If someone turns up and does the lifestyle questionnaire and they get 3 ones, that's a restoration session only. You don't do any intensity. So it's really easy. There's, what's in your environment. If you've got, whole body vibration, if you've got hot and cold, if you've got breath work, if you, whatever, what have you got? Here's your options. There's the videos. Go to it.
Yeah, it's great. So you provide them that awareness and that education, and then and obviously with that in mind, they can then incorporate this as they wish, whether it's priming or, as you said, that 24-hour approach is important. Whether it's post work, they've had a stressful day. Okay, here's some activities that you can do. So it's very integrated in that sense, not simply for pre or post training session, as I'm hearing it.
And Tarek, I think what's really important for the listener to understand is that we're not talking about athletes here. We're talking about corporates. We're talking about anyone who has a business. We're talking about kids with learning disabilities, kids who get stressed going to school because they can't get heard. And it's interesting because once you start to understand the difference between eustress and distress, I don't know how many kids over the years that I've had who basically have said they've been diagnosed with various types of challenges. Let's call them mental challenges. And I've brought them into the studio. I've asked them what sport they played, what hobbies they like, whatever it may be. And most of the kids where I live, they love their surfing, skateboarding, stuff like that, stuff that my kids did. And I've got some sandbells. So the sandbells are just neoprene pieces of rubber filled with sand. So as a surfer, that sort of makes sense, right? Because you surf on a beach and you have a neoprene suit on normally. So I start throwing that at the kid gently in a manner in which we're just playing. And then I'll start asking some questions about, what's happening at school? Why does that, why don't they understand that? What's the question you find hardest to get to answer? I just ask them questions. And it's amazing when they're playing with an object that makes them feel comfortable, how much clarity they come out with.
And also the trust. It also brings out this element of this, because it's embodied, right? Like everything's stored, it's emotionally stored, and you can connect through physiology, that sort of neural breakaway, that breakthrough of that, whatever's stuck, you're able to open that up through play, through activities that you've connected them with. I think that's the magic thing. And one thing that I've constantly taught in workshops, and I've been inspired by you, are the balloons, right? Like just gamifying the warm-up process. And then how many people laugh and smile and all of a sudden, it breaks the ice completely. And notwithstanding all of the other benefits of incorporating playful elements, I think, whether that's for priming or whether that's for just essentially connecting with that client and treating them as that human being, I think really comes out as being important here.
And Tarek, I think, because I love what you just said then, I think something that we've really got to emphasize here, the title of this podcast is Fascia and Fluid Flow. You put someone into a play environment, their fascia thrives on variety, variability. It loves challenge 3-dimensionally. It wants to have this fluid moving in it. And when it gets this ability to move in various directions, heights, distances, all of a sudden now the tissue becomes healthier. You have a scenario where the fluid moves better. You have more oxygen to the brain, so the decision's actually going to be far better. Fascia and bone are renowned for storing emotion. So you have the opportunity through play to shift the crap that's in their system. There's so many intricacies, the smarts are under the table, right, mate?
Yeah, and the nervous system, that cells that wire together, fire together, all of those that come together. It's just quite beautiful. One thing, we're running a little out of time, but we do have just a few minutes. You did mention that by just following contrast immersions, we may in fact create more challenges for the tissues with stagnation and stress. And I wanted to highlight that because without the education and without differentiating between sport performance, we're looking maybe through social media, through the lens of that, and seeing, this athlete's doing cold therapy, so maybe I should go and do that because it's going to be beneficial. You want to just talk to that a little bit and just sort of bring awareness to perhaps the listeners who, all of us fall into different traps at times, and it's like being aware of like the differences between what an athlete might be needing and doing compared to what we might be needing as a non-professional athlete, let's say.
Once again, the biggest thing that we would do with anyone was put them through the lifestyle questionnaire to find out where their stresses are today. So if I'm a person who is struggling to get fluid flow, putting someone into cold water, probably the worst thing you can do, because you think about it, fluid doesn't flow in cold, it flows in heat. So something like an infrared might be a far better choice to get lymphatic circulation and so forth, fascial fluid to get stimulated. And you might do a little bit of movement, bit of breathing in there. All of a sudden, you're going to change the environment. There's some big research coming out now about females and cold therapy. Females shouldn't go into anything less than 9 to 12 degrees C. And what they're finding is that it has a lot to do with their cycles, menopause. It affects them hormonally in a negative manner, largely. So once again, there's the research that came out initially was a lot about the brain. It has huge benefits for the brain and changing anxiety and depression. But we've got to understand the person who's getting into the hot and cold, what do they need for their tissues? Because if we don't understand that, we may in fact be creating problems by giving them the incorrect recovery structure of contrast therapy, for instance. So as I said before, me having a visceral response to cold, I don't have no problem standing under a cold shower for 1 or 2 minutes. In fact, I quite enjoy it, especially if I'm going to jump into a sauna. But if I put into a tub, my visceral response, it would inflame me. It would make me worse. It would actually damage my tissues. So we've got to understand where the client is stress-wise, understand what they enjoy, and then apply that by giving them a choice of what's in your environment. If they've got hot and cold, that's fine. Maybe a few questions could eliminate the fact of decreasing their experience.
Yeah, that's brilliantly said. And I think it's pertinent and important for the listener as well to be aware of that. Always ask this question, if there's one thing that you'd want to see changed in the industry, call it fitness, wellness, health, in and around what we've discussed, perhaps, what would that be?
Be more inclusive. You train the human being, not the human body.
That's a beautiful way to finish this great conversation. And there's plenty to obviously focus on in the next conversation, Ian. So I think I'm going to rope you in and we're going to deep dive into that tub together and light the show. Yeah, and it's been great having you. Pleasure, Ian.
Thank you so much for what you do. This is really, and I mean this for the listeners, without people like you, the industry can't evolve and it can't change in the positive manner that it needs. Coming from a person who's been around a long time, I guess that means I'm old, but we can't continue to do this. It's people like you who have the passion, the vision, the authenticity, and the values. If we can support you to continue to doing, the industry's got a huge positive tick beside it because you really are creating change, which is just amazing. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, no, it really means a lot and appreciate that humbly. And yeah, we'll continue to do the good work and do that together as well. I think the collaboration is key. And if they want to find you, we'll have the SOMA and maybe some resources in the show notes. If there's anything useful for the listener, that would be tremendous, Ian. So,
and Tarek, also listeners, if you've got questions, if you enjoyed what we spoke about today and you've got questions further about it, please email. We can maybe have a discussion again about it, but because we want to help you get the best outcome for you. That's what we do. That's our job. We're coaches. So, if you've got something that's bothering you, you're not sure on, please just email Tarek. We'll give you some sort of direction, some sort of opportunity for you to make the best decision for you.
I love your openness and always giving mentality, Ian. And that's a great piece of advice. And because this never stops, this conversation will continue to fascinate people. And it's important too that we have these types of conversations and also provide other pathways if someone wants to deep dive into Ian's mentorships and the education, which I highly recommend if those of you who want to be educated in this space, seek Ian out because he's really at the forefront of this, him and his team. And you can always hit us up about that. And until next time, Ian, keep up the great work. If you enjoyed this episode, could you do me a quick favor? If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, could you please add your 5-star rating? Doing this really does support the show and gets our episodes in front of listeners just like yourself. Thanks for your support. I greatly appreciate it.